Naomi Graves was supposed to be dead. The world had buried her name, erased her existence, and sealed away the secrets she once protected. But when she walked into that airport, alive, untouched by time, and carrying a boarding pass that shouldn't exist, she didn't just shake the system, she shattered it. Here's the expanded version of your story. The terminal buzzed with the usual evening chaos as passengers hurried to catch their flights. At gate 42, a woman in an elegant black coat approached the counter, her face calm, eyes scanning her surroundings with quiet awareness. She handed over her boarding pass, and as the agent ran it through the scanner, a sharp beep echoed through the space. The red error screen flashed. The agent frowned, tried again, and the same result appeared. A quick glance at the details showed no immediate discrepancies. The name matched the passport she carried, and the ticket looked authentic, yet the system refused to recognize it. The line behind her grew restless as the agent politely asked her to step aside. The woman did not argue. She nodded, moving without resistance as murmurs spread among onlookers. A security officer stationed nearby approached. The agent explained the issue, showing the screen where the airline's system simply refused to acknowledge the boarding pass. It wasn't a standard counterfeit case. Those usually triggered warnings about duplications or payment failures. This was different. It was as if the pass had been generated by something outside the airline's systems entirely. Security requested her ID. She handed it over without hesitation, her expression unreadable. The officer scanned the card, and almost instantly, his demeanor changed. His radio crackled with an urgent request. A second officer arrived, then a third. Something was very wrong. Less than 5 minutes later, federal agents entered the gate area. They moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on the woman who remained still, hands at her sides. They didn't ask questions. One of them, a tall man with an earpiece, took the ID from the security officer and examined it closely. Then he turned the card over and scanned the fingerprint associated with the document. The moment the system pulled up results, his face went pale. The name on the ID belonged to a woman who had been declared dead 10 years ago. Passengers whispered, some recording discreetly on their phones. No one knew the full story yet, but tension filled the air. The woman had made no attempt to flee, no sign of resistance, no argument to prove her innocence. She simply watched. Agents quietly signaled for her to be detained. 2 officers flanked her, gently but firmly leading her away from the gate. While she was escorted through the terminal, a different kind of panic spread behind the scenes. The name associated with her fingerprint was Dr. Naomi Graves, an aeronautics engineer who had once been a rising star in aviation technology. She specialized in navigation systems, working on high-level projects meant to make global air travel more secure. But in 2013, a tragic plane crash took her life. At least, that was what the official reports claimed. Her death had been confirmed, her remains identified. The airline she had once worked for even issued a statement honoring her contributions to the industry. Yet, here she was walking through an airport, alive. Behind closed doors, federal agents scoured classified databases. They needed to understand how a dead woman had not only reappeared, but managed to obtain a seemingly flawless boarding pass that bypassed every level of security until the final scan. Within minutes, deeper searches revealed something even more unsettling. There had been multiple recent breaches in airline security systems, none of which had been made public. Several international flights had experienced brief, unexplained anomalies in their navigation controls. Pilots reported momentary losses of control, subtle course deviations that corrected themselves within minutes. No passengers were aware, and no crashes had occurred. But the implications were terrifying. Someone had found a way to manipulate global flight systems from the inside. Dr. Naomi Graves had worked on this very technology, and now, after a decade of presumed death, she had resurfaced at a major airport with a ticket that should not exist. The interrogation room remained silent as agents reviewed surveillance footage of the gate. Every angle confirmed the same eerie truth. Naomi had walked in alone, passed through multiple layers of airport security, and only been stopped at the final boarding check. No accomplices, no external interference. Yet somehow, she had accessed and manipulated a system that was supposedly impenetrable. Then came the most disturbing discovery. As they cross-checked her ID against travel records, Investigators found something that shouldn't have been possible. Naomi Graves' name had appeared in boarding logs before, dozens of times in the past 2 years. Not once had she been stopped. Her name had slipped through without detection. But tonight, for the first time, the system had rejected her. Either something had changed in the way she operated, or someone had intentionally flagged her. Before they could ask their first question, an emergency alert flashed across multiple agency channels. A flight en route from New York to London had vanished from radar. One moment, it was traveling on its scheduled path. The next, its transponder signal had disappeared. Air traffic control was unable to reestablish contact. As security teams rushed to Naomi's holding room, the situation became even more baffling. The chair where she had been seated was empty. The guards stationed outside swore they had not seen her leave. Camera feeds showed something impossible. At the exact moment the London flight vanished, the footage inside the interrogation room glitched, a 2-second break in the recording. When the feed resumed, Naomi Graves was gone. A single message was left on the computer monitor in front of the agents. "It's not me you should be looking for. It's them." By morning, aviation authorities, government officials, and security agencies scrambled to contain the news. The public was told the missing flight was experiencing technical difficulties. No mention of Naomi Graves was made. No records of her interrogation were filed. But those who had seen her that night knew one thing for certain: she had never intended to board that plane. She had come to deliver a message, and whatever she had been trying to warn them about was already in motion. The woman remained silent as she was led down a secured hallway toward an isolated holding room, her posture unshaken, her expression unreadable. The agents escorting her moved with a heightened sense of urgency, exchanging brief, cryptic glances as they gripped their radios tightly. Protocol dictated that any suspected fraud should be processed by airport security, but this was no ordinary case. Within minutes, 2 federal officers arrived, bypassing standard airport procedures altogether. They had been monitoring the situation since the initial ID scan triggered an internal alert, one that was only activated for high-priority threats. The woman sat in the metal chair provided, resting her hands on the table, watching as the officers reviewed the information on their screens. They had expected her to ask questions, to deny, to plead. She did none of these things. The first agent, still gripping the ID in his hand, entered a deeper search query into the system. What he found made his breath catch. The name Naomi Graves had not been used in any official records for over a decade. The last recorded activity linked to her identity was the day of her reported death. Her bank accounts were frozen, her assets liquidated, her credentials revoked. There was no sign of fraudulent use, no stolen identity alerts, nothing. The system treated her as though she had never existed beyond the date of her alleged accident. Yet, there she was, sitting across from them, her ID perfectly intact, her fingerprints matching every record available. It wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was something much worse. The deeper they searched, the more disturbing the details became. Naomi Graves had once been an essential figure in classified aviation projects, specializing in next-generation navigation systems. Her work focused on securing autopilot functions from external interference, making it theoretically impossible for commercial flights to be remotely hijacked. She had been part of a team that developed an impenetrable system, until suddenly the project was shut down. The official reasoning cited funding cuts, but the records were vague. Shortly after, Naomi's supposed death occurred in what was described as an unfortunate accident, involving a prototype test flight. The few who had worked alongside her were either unreachable or had also vanished from public life. No clear connections were made at the time. The officer scrolling through her file stopped as he reached a restricted section, locked under federal clearance. When he attempted access, his screen went black. The security override was automatic, triggered by an internal safeguard. It wasn't the usual classification block. It was as if the system itself was preventing any further access. The officers exchanged looks. One of them stood up, moving toward the door to call in additional clearance. But before he could reach for his radio, a different alert flashed across his screen. Another breach. Another breach. But this time it was bigger. The security grid monitoring all incoming and outgoing flights at the airport was experiencing interference. Small fluctuations in system controls, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, began appearing in the logs. Minor course corrections on several flights had occurred in rapid succession, adjustments no pilot had initiated. Flight data from multiple commercial airlines reflected the same irregularities. The changes were subtle, no more than a few degrees off course, but for those who understood aviation software, it was a silent warning. Someone was testing something. It was at that moment that a phone rang inside the interrogation room. Not one of the agent's phones. It was the desk phone mounted on the wall, an internal line that wasn't supposed to receive external calls. One of the agents hesitated before picking it up. A distorted voice, barely above a whisper, came through the receiver. "She doesn't belong to you." The line went dead. The agent turned, expecting Naomi to react, to show some sign of recognition, but she remained exactly as she had before, unmoving, her expression unchanged. The silence pressed against the room like a physical force. Something was happening, something beyond their control, and she knew it. As they processed the strange call, a new wave of alerts flooded the system. A flight that had just left JFK bound for London was no longer responding to air traffic control. The aircraft had maintained its altitude, its engines functioning normally, but it had ceased all external communication. Its transponder signal, the beacon used to track its precise location, had gone dark. No emergency call had been made, no distress signal was sent. It was as if the plane had simply slipped out of reach. The realization hit all at once. This was no isolated incident. Whatever had been set into motion had been planned long before tonight. The urgency in the agent's movements increased as they prepared to extract Naomi to a higher security location. But when they turned back toward her chair, they found it empty. The room had one exit, and no one had opened the door. The security footage confirmed something even more impossible. At the exact moment the London flight disappeared from radar, the cameras inside the interrogation room suffered a 2-second blackout. When the feed resumed, Naomi Graves was gone. No sound, no movement, no trace. She had never intended to board that plane. She had never planned to escape in the traditional sense. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to disappear. The deeper they dug into Naomi Graves' past, the more the facts refused to align. The official records said she had died in 2013, yet every system they ran her ID through confirmed her identity beyond a doubt. No stolen credentials, no forged history. She wasn't pretending to be Naomi Graves. She was her. That left them with an impossible question. Where had she been for the last 10 years, and why had she chosen now to return? The urgency to find answers intensified as new reports surfaced. The anomalies in the airline's navigation system weren't isolated to a single flight. Over the past 6 months, more than a dozen flights had experienced strange disruptions, moments where autopilot functions had briefly overridden pilot controls, minor course corrections that weren't requested. They had been dismissed as technical glitches, but now with Naomi's sudden reappearance, those glitches took on an entirely different meaning. One agent in particular, a cybersecurity specialist reviewing the breaches, noticed a chilling pattern. The affected flights all had one thing in common. They had passed through airspace monitored by a now defunct aviation defense program known as Project Halcyon. The program had been designed to create an impenetrable layer of security for global air travel, using artificial intelligence to predict and neutralize potential threats. But it had been shut down under mysterious circumstances right around the time of Naomi's supposed death. Project Halcyon had been her creation. The files on the project had been buried under layers of clearance restrictions, but something or someone had been slowly unearthing its remnants. The breaches, the flight anomalies, the missing aircraft, it all pointed to a reactivation of something long thought to be dead. And Naomi, the woman who had designed the system, had just walked into an airport with an impossible boarding pass right before a major international flight vanished from the radar. A new priority alert came through, this time from the highest level of aviation security. The missing London flight had just reappeared, but not where it was supposed to be. The transponder signal flickered back online for exactly 10 seconds before going dark again. In that brief window, The flight data placed the aircraft thousands of miles from its original route, far from any known air traffic corridors. It was somewhere over the Arctic Circle, moving at an altitude that should have been impossible given its fuel capacity. More disturbingly, there had been no distress calls from the pilots, no response to the emergency frequencies. It was as if the plane was being flown by something or someone entirely separate from its crew. Then, another anomaly. A separate flight, this one bound for Tokyo, experienced a 2-second black screen on its monitoring systems. It was identical to what had happened in Naomi's interrogation room, the same eerie disruption that had coincided with her disappearance. The Tokyo flight resumed normal operations almost instantly, but the implications were terrifying. Whatever was happening, it was spreading, and Naomi Graves had known it would. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Naomi Graves wasn't just another missing person who had resurfaced. She was at the center of something much larger. Every new discovery pointed to a hidden conflict that had been unfolding beneath the surface for years. The irregularities in commercial flight data, the subtle manipulation of autopilot systems, the unexplained shifts in course. Someone had been testing the limits of airline security. And now, with Naomi's sudden reappearance, it was obvious that those tests were leading up to something far more dangerous. Security teams scrambled to track her last known movements within the airport. Surveillance footage from the interrogation room showed the brief flicker of static just before she vanished. But when they checked the broader airport feeds, they found something even more disturbing. Naomi had been seen exiting a restricted staff corridor minutes after disappearing from the holding room. The footage showed her moving with purpose, bypassing multiple security checkpoints without any resistance. It was as if she belonged there, as if the system itself recognized her as someone with access. She had walked straight to an unmarked terminal, one not listed on any official airport maps. And then she was gone. Meanwhile, the situation with the missing London flight was growing even stranger. Satellite imaging showed the plane's last known position, but there was no indication of where it had gone after its signal was lost again. It was as if the aircraft had been absorbed into empty space. The idea of a commercial plane disappearing entirely with no wreckage, no distress signal, no trace, was impossible. Yet it had happened, and for some reason, Naomi had chosen this exact moment to resurface. The investigation shifted focus to the last known employees who had worked on Project Halcyon. Many had disappeared from public life, some under questionable circumstances. A few were still active in the aviation industry, but none were willing to discuss the project. One former engineer had died under suspicious circumstances just 2 months prior, a supposed car accident with no clear cause. Another had left the country years ago, now living in complete isolation in a remote part of South America. The more they searched, the clearer it became. Someone had been erasing all traces of the project and the people who had worked on it. The deeper they dug, the more anomalies surfaced. Commercial airlines had quietly paid out settlements to pilots who had reported strange malfunctions mid-flight. Some had spoken of brief losses of control, moments where the aircraft had seemingly overridden their commands before stabilizing again. None of these cases had made it to the public, but within the industry, rumors had been growing. Pilots were beginning to fear that their planes weren't entirely in their control. And now, with the London flight missing and Naomi Graves gone without a trace, it was no longer just a theory. Something had been building in the shadows, a slow and deliberate manipulation of the very foundation of air travel, and whatever Naomi had been trying to stop, it had already begun. Panic spread through the highest levels of aviation security as the reality of the situation became undeniable. The disappearance of the London flight was not an isolated event. The same anomalies were spreading across multiple international routes. Brief disruptions in autopilot controls, split-second blackouts in radar signals, and security systems failing at crucial checkpoints. It was as if an unseen force was infiltrating the most advanced aviation networks in the world, and the only person who seemed to understand what was happening had vanished without a trace. The last known footage of Naomi Graves showed her walking into an unlisted terminal, a part of the airport that, on paper, didn't exist. Security logs showed no record of its access, no scheduled flights, no assigned personnel. Yet Naomi had walked through its doors like she belonged there. And then, nothing. No additional footage, no activity, no evidence of where she had gone. It was as if she had stepped out of reality itself. Desperation turned to urgency as investigators focused on the defunct Project Halcyon. The program had been designed to create an impenetrable security network, an AI-driven system that could predict and neutralize threats before they occurred. But if that system had been reactivated, and worse, if it had been corrupted, then the implications were terrifying. A network designed to protect the skies was now being used to control them. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A lone technician monitoring global flight paths discovered an unusual pattern. Every aircraft that had experienced an anomaly had intersected a specific flight corridor, one that no longer officially existed. Decades ago, it had been used for high-security government flights, but it had been decommissioned after the shutdown of a classified project. The name of that project? Halcyon. The truth was finally coming into focus. Project Halcyon hadn't been shut down. It had been hidden. And someone, perhaps Naomi herself, had found a way to bring it back online. As this realization set in, a chilling alert came through. The missing London flight had reappeared. Not on radar, but as a ghost signal, a transmission that wasn't supposed to exist. A static-filled audio feed began broadcasting on emergency aviation channels, a distorted, broken message repeating on a loop. They were never meant to leave. You have to stop it. The voice was faint, barely intelligible, but it was clear enough to recognize it was Naomi Graves. Then the transmission cut off. At that exact moment, an aircraft preparing for takeoff at the very airport where Naomi had disappeared experienced a sudden, unexplained system failure. The plane's onboard computer shut down entirely for 4.2 seconds, just enough time for every flight control to reset. When the systems came back online, the aircraft's destination had been altered. No pilot had touched the controls. The plane was now programmed for a route that led directly into the abandoned Halcyon airspace, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it.